Hey, thanks for watching this video on sermon series and theme development. It's all about just more of a bird's eye view of sermon planning and theme development. I know we can get real practical on sermon writing, and we can do that, but this really purpose of this is really take you from that week in and week out to a little bit more of how to plan for a year when it comes to sermon planning and developing your themes for youth ministry. Now, I know that a lot of the trouble and the difficulty a lot in youth ministry is being able to come in with a message every single week to your students, being fresh, giving them something that they can take home and really make for practical living, something that you're going to inspire them with, and knowing that you're hearing from God, that you're not just hearing from someone else or just coming up with something last minute. But really the purpose of this is I know you can minister to students a week in and week out, and you're ministering to students who are procrastinators, but doesn't mean you have to be one to minister to them. And so really I hope that you're able to kind of see with me how God can give you revelation, and God can give you something for a year, and God can help guide you where you're going with your youth ministry, and not just what's happening for this week or what's happening for the next week, but really try to get yourself to plan a little bit further out from that. And now some of it may be a little bit philosophical in the idea behind can God speak to you a year out? Can God speak to you 3 months or 6 months out? And if you believe enough to know that God could speak to you for this week coming up, and that God could give you something from His Holy Spirit that is according to His Word, that's for your students this week, then I think I would argue to say that you could also have something that God gives you for what He has for your students this year. I really believe that there's some intentional things you can be doing, and that's really where I want to get more of the practical side of this in this talk. But I want to take a look at Galatians chapter 1, and Paul's writing to the church, and he's correcting them from receiving a false gospel. So that's kind of the context in this, and saying, let's remind you of what I first preached to you. But in verse 12 of chapter 1, I want to stick here today is chapter 1, verse 12. He says, "I received my message from no human source, and no one taught me. Instead, I received it by direct revelation from Jesus Christ." Now, obviously, he's delivering a message to the Galatians here, but more than that, I believe he's delivering a message that it transcends time. It transcends the context of just the church here in Galatia, but it's more about how it speaks to us today. It speaks to us. It's not some foreign gospel that he's teaching. It's something he's reminding them of how he spoke long ago, but he's giving to them. It's the same good news message. It's the very good news. There's only one good news, and it's the good news of Jesus Christ. So bottom line, each week we should know going into it that our message is going to be centered on the person of Jesus Christ. So no matter what you're doing, or whatever you feel like you're speaking on, whether you feel like God's asked you to speak on these students' personal finances or faith and developing strong character, integrity, or you feel like maybe talking on family, whatever it may be that you feel like is stirring in your heart, if it's not lining first of all with the Word of God, and it's not centered on the person of Jesus Christ, then I would say it's irrelevant, and you need to throw that out. It's not a good message. At the end of the day, it should be good news. I know a lot of times you want to speak to your students right where they're at. You want to encourage them. Maybe you want to build them up. Sometimes you want to maybe, if you're honest, you're heading into a service and you're heavy on your heart about the mess that they're in or the brokenness that's in their lives, and you just want to bring correction or rebuke. Even in the spirit of rebuke, even in the spirit of coming in with correction, it has to be good news. It has to be good news, and there's hope that Jesus Christ is the only one who can transform their lives and can make things better. And so I know that's a little bit more philosophy there. It's a little bit more of the core behind the message. But if we don't get that, then we miss everything. If we don't understand that Jesus Christ is the only one who can change, He's the only one who can bring power to your service and the message, and it's the only thing that your students can be able to take home and actually benefit their lives. You maybe will have a tweetable moment or a great a great point that really makes logical sense and reasoning. But even as Paul's writing here, he says, "My dear brothers," in the previous verse in chapter 1, verse 11, he says, "Dear brothers and sisters, I want you to understand that the gospel message I preach is not based on mere human reasoning. And so even the best strategy, even the best intentions, the best preparation going into a theme development or sermon planning can be missed completely if it's not centered on the person of Jesus Christ and the only one who can transform their life. And so I want to make that very clear. I don't want us to move on from that point too quickly. So I want you to be able to just take time and really assess that. Ask yourself: is what I'm speaking out of this, is the tone? Is it good news? Is it truly that I have hope in the situation? And whatever I'm speaking, even if it's bringing correction or rebuke, or maybe it's to call out some cultural issues that are taking place, and I want to speak to those. And your message should not be doom and gloom. It shouldn't be a mad prophet angry about whatever that's taking place. You may be angry at the sin, but you're not angry about these kids. The good news is that even though their difficulty that they're having, it's this idea that God is able to help them from their mess. That's the only reason we get up to speak, and we have hope to even week in, week out deliver a message. And so I want to make that very clear. But then to look a little bit beyond that, if we can understand this, I really do believe God blesses our intention. I believe that God does bless our heart to prepare and not procrastinate. I love that God uses the giftings and the talents that are in you as a youth pastor. And obviously there's some sort of gifting that has qualified you. God has qualified you, but there's something that's qualified you for youth ministry. There's a reason you're doing youth ministry today. There's a reason you're speaking to the students' hearts in this culture. You may have a gift of communication. You may be able to speak really well. I remember when I was called into youth ministry and God really spoke into my life, He called me to speak at a youth camp. And I was definitely not excited about that myself. I was excited that God wanted to use me, but when it came to speaking, I know for me it intimidated me because I wasn't into public speaking. I didn't think I could do that. And so I got a degree when I went to college in communications to help develop my communication skills. I knew this would be a lifelong process to get better at this. But for some, it just comes naturally. You have a gift of charisma. You have just this ability to draw students, and so whatever message you deliver, you could be talking about those object sermons, and someone just gives you a water bottle, and somehow you can talk about the gospel through the living water, and you can just go off on that point, and that impromptu kind of message that it really doesn't take a whole lot of preparation. And I want to challenge you as a leader, if you are that leader who just you can rely on those giftings and those gift sets. I want you to know that may be okay for a time, but at some point that well will run dry. You can only you have a certain capacity in leadership to continue off of your giftings, and if it isn't a direct revelation from God, this message that He's filled you up, the Holy Spirit has enabled you to pour out and to speak wisdom into these students' lives, to speak life change, then really it's just a talk, and it's a good speech, and there's nothing different about this. I was with a ministry friend, and they were talking about a context of students that were at another church, and it was not within the Christian church. It was another kind of another religion, kind of another thing happening, and these students that were browsing around different religions, they were kind of trying to figure out really where their faith was at, and they were really curious. They're really seekers. They went to several different places, and then they found themselves eventually in a Christian church, and it was just a message that was delivered, a great speaker, and at the end of it, kind of evaluated feedback. Hey, what'd you think of the service? How was it? And they're like, no, it was really good. It was a good speech. But it wasn't anything different than what we've kind of been going to. It just had some logical points and good things, and but it wasn't really anything too much different than we've heard before. And it really challenged the minister in that, and it really challenged them to the point of thinking, man, if there's no difference in my speech and my delivery than someone else's or what's taking place, then really what does this come down to? And so I think being able to really come back to the point of is the gospel message in my service, is it the power of God that I'm displaying in it, and is it just my fine speech? Is it my human reasoning? Is it these things, or is it the very message of the gospel? And so I want to make sure that that is something would challenge you and just to encourage you to say, you know what, you may have a gifting in this, you may have a talent, and God's enabled you, but make sure that this is something that it comes down to preparation. And if God could speak to you for this given week coming up, if God could speak to you about this next month, then I believe that God could give you a burden in your heart for this coming year and what you would do and take these students on a journey. And so I have some of this context personally with this. My first couple of years in youth ministry, I was a part of a church on the local church level to really plan out a calendar year and really think about the direction we'd be taking a student ministry of over 1,000 students. And we worked as a staff and a team, but my responsibility, some of my privilege was to really get a burden in my heart for where we would be going for the year, how we'd plan that out and map it out on a sermon calendar. And one of the ways to do this and make it intentional is you just have to plan a meeting. You plan a sermon planning meeting, plan a theme development meeting, and not just a meeting where it's just going to be over a conference table and just kind of hashing it out, trying to think through things. You got to think about some things about what's important at this meeting. And the first thing I feel like that's really important in creating this is actually put it on your calendar. Actually take your year calendar out, however you use it. If you're still kind of analog, find the calendar that's a paper, and you just take out your little journal, or maybe you're on your phone and you've got an app for your calendar. However you use it, get out your calendar and actually mark out a day in the year. If you don't schedule it, your time will already schedule you, and you'll just kind of get going in the year and you'll miss it again. But take out a date in the year, and my encouragement is to actually take a quarterly sermon planning meeting. So find 4 dates in the year where you're going to block off at least half the day. And I know just fighting for time, it just sounds insane already, but if you do it this upcoming year and just find those times, block it out, make it a priority, and you really believe that about yourself, that God could speak to you and can deliver those things, then I would say plan out 4 meetings in the year where you're going to designate time, and you're going to get around those that are going to be adding to that meeting. Maybe people that are on your core team. Maybe it's a leader that has influence that you're bringing in your youth ministry. It could be a student that is also there, a strong student leader who's going to be able to pray with you, is mature enough to be able to really stay focused in a meeting like that. But I know the more structured you are in this meeting, the more you're kind of, again, having these human reasoning, these things behind it. So having a little bit of blank space, kind of this white canvas to be able to kind of paint on and say, you know what, we're going to throw out ideas, we're going to throw out different things. I think you should be prepared to come to those meetings. So don't just come and have nothing, have blank space, but be able to come prepared in your heart to say, you know what, we're going to deliver some things that are fresh on our hearts, some things that are going to be picking up. And if you just have those dates scheduled, so 4 dates out of the year, if you have 4 dates going, I would say that you're going to you're going to have that thought of, man, I have a planning meeting coming ahead, and something fresh comes to your mind. Go ahead and write that down and bring it to those meetings. If you find a link regarding something, or maybe gives inspiration to you somehow, bring all those things to that meeting, and that's fine. Just kind of there's no bad idea that's going to be brought to a meeting in that time. You can sift through it and assess it during that time. But just bring those thoughts, bring those ideas before a sermon planning meeting in that time. And the first part of your meeting, and so kind of talking a little bit more of the order regarding those meetings, it would be when you go into that first meeting, I would just encourage you, like any time, to open with a time of prayer, a time of direct revelation, saying, God, would you speak to us? We're going to carve out this time, and we only have maybe a certain amount of hours on the calendar today in our schedule, but we just believe that you're going to speak to us today. And so I would just ask of you to go into a meeting like that with anticipation, expectation that God is going to reveal His word to you. He's going to bring inspiration to you. He's going to be right there with you in the planning of the meeting. And kind of going back to the first point, if God's not the center at the beginning, then it's really a waste, and it's all for nothing at the end of the day. And so invite God into that planning meeting and just say, God, we want you to be at the center of this. We want you to speak to us. And we're going to have all these ideas and creative thoughts that come into this, but we're going to ask that you would pour out your spirit in this and really speak to us about what you would have us do for our youth ministry in our context. And I think when you schedule a meeting like that, it's intentional. It's you come with faith, you come with expectation, but you're really inviting God to take control over that agenda, to really guide your meeting in that time. And when you set it first priority to him, he's going to take the rest of that time and just really, as you flesh out ideas or different things that come, it's not carnal thoughts that come. It's not just these moral reasoning or these fine speech that are come about, but we're believing that God, you're going to pour out your Spirit in this meeting, and you're going to use our time together to really maximize and facilitate creativity, inspiration. And I know you can get those inspiration from other things, like I mentioned, bringing links and bringing other ideas, inspiration to that meeting. But I just believe when you come in and just really put it before God and you put it on the table together and say, God, we just ask that you would bless this, that you would have time for this. And I know that another part of this, it's, again, back to kind of your resource, whatever is available to you. But I feel like if you can come into this meeting and really preparing the right place for this meeting, sometimes you can be in more of a stale environment, conference table, or, you may feel like, hey, we're going to plan a meeting and go to a local coffee shop. And that may be great intention, but really the ease of distraction becomes so apparent in that moment where there's others looking and there's other things happening. So making sure it's a private moment where you're asking God for his presence, but you're also really preparing your hearts to be in an atmosphere where he can speak, where you're really tuned in and listening to him. And so, whether you put on some music, some worship music in the background, and you're praying, you're seeking God in that time to begin with, or you're in silence and you just bring the Word of God with you, and you're kind of meditating on His Word. You're asking of God to just pour out His Spirit in that time. Really pay attention to the setting of where you're meeting, and not just when you're meeting or who you're meeting with, but where you're meeting is going to be very important as well. And I think in that time to really look at taking out a calendar, taking out a real, again, whether that be on a paper calendar, kind of mapping it out. Maybe you write it out, kind of look at just month by month, saying, hey, we got January through December. Let's look at this as a calendar year. Many youth ministries will look at it that way and look at their fiscal year from a January to a December, but others kind of go with a school year, and really that comes down to the culture of your youth ministry, the culture of your church, as to what's going to make most sense, whether that be going through from August to July and just kind of hitting it strong with the theme starting in August, going into the school year, or maybe you're looking at more of the year and saying, hey, January to December. As a youth ministry in Arizona for the Arizona Ministry Network, what we're providing as a resource is to look at really, we ask God, would you look at not just this year, but would you look at 5 years? And God, would you give us a plan and a game plan of a revolving 5 years of what you would want students in Arizona to learn, and make sure that these are cultural shifts that are taking place and things that we just believe are principles that are important to youth ministry that we say as essential. And so we looked at it from a 5-year plan. And I know if God can do that and speak to us for 5 years, then I believe that God could speak to you for 1 year, that God could give you revelation for this upcoming month or this coming 6 months. And so when he spoke to us about 5 years, it was to look at this as really a fivefold ministry approach of saying we want to make sure that Arizona Youth Ministries is known for prayer. We want to make sure that Arizona Youth Ministries is known for discipleship, for evangelism, for fellowship, and for service or for ministry. And so kind of that fivefold purpose of the church, that Saddleback or Rick Warren model, it's used in many ways, but it's really, there's no other way to look at it other than these are 5 things that are really important when it comes to church ministry in general, and it's important for youth to understand these and grasp, kind of get hold of it. And it's not that 1 year we're going to just only focus on one and neglect the rest, obviously, but it's saying, in this year, we're going to make emphasis and make sure that we raise the bar in this area, that under our watch, that we make sure that this is important. And so what we're providing in this last year, 2017, and going into 2018, we're looking at actually providing 2017 was a year of discipleship, and 2018 we're looking at focusing our resources and intentionality behind evangelism as an area of focus, and saying that the burden for the lost, the urgency for the Great Commission is important, that students need to know this. And so when we look at it, and I'll take this as an example, 2018 as a year of evangelism, and looking at this as a year, well, it may not be that the name of our theme is evangelism. It may not be the most appealing or drawing theme for a whole year. Just say, hey, we're gonna really go out on evangelism this year. Outreach may not even be the same thing either, but to really kind of grasp what is it that's in our heart, what's burning in our hearts for this. And we're going in line with our national theme in this idea of until all know. And so until all know is kind of that undergirding that drive behind why we're doing what we're doing. And so we're focusing an entire year on until all know Jesus. That idea behind every person deserves a right to know the gospel. And so we're taking a year in emphasis of that. But within that giving year, that may be kind of our cry, our heart behind that. You may look at your year and just saying, if it's starting in August or if it's starting in January, however you do it, saying, God, what would you have us do for this year? And if you want to get behind as youth ministry, kind of where we're going as a state and a ministry network, then you can come along with us for evangelism as just a year of intention and focus. You can utilize the resources we're doing, contextualize it for your purpose, but really looking at this and saying, God, would you speak to us through your word? What does your word have to say about evangelism? What do students need to know about this when it comes to their daily lives and their walks with you? And so we look at that as a whole, as a big picture, and it's not just this, okay, this week we're looking at evangelism, the next week I wonder what God will speak to us, but as a year we're looking at evangelism as this drive, this force that we're taking one message and saying, God, we're going to really break this into a whole year, making sure students understand this. And I know when you first say that, it sounds like, oh man, that's going to get redundant really fast. How much more can you just say about evangelism and the importance of winning your friends and winning your family and winning the strangers or their enemies, and where do you go from there? From that, I feel like we've said everything, and I think that's where it's important to know. Within that giving year, I think it's important to understand the times, understand the natural seasons where there's already kind of a grace on something or there's momentum with something. And so the beginning of the year, when we look at January, typically when we start out the year, we're looking at casting vision. And so that's something where you've got to say it several times to begin the year, that we're going to really start strong with this theme, that we're going to really launch this out. And you may have a couple services to begin, and getting back from Christmas break, it may be difficult to find that time. But if sometimes mid-January seems to be a good time when kind of you have the attendance back, you have everyone kind of back in from Christmas break. It's not kind of the lull from December, kind of the holidays coming into it. And so you may establish kind of a launch date, a kind of a vision casting date. And that could be, again, mid-January, some kind of bump it back to the end of January, maybe even early February, kind of where, all you're doing in January is really kind of, preparing and maybe having prayer services and times to really prepare your hearts and getting ready for that launch. But however you do it, whenever you do launch at the beginning of the year, I think it needs to be very clear and focused what your message is, what you're speaking, and really where you're going for this year, and just believing that God's gonna give the student ministry, help raise the bar in this area and help them get closer to Christ at the end of the day. And so you look at that as the beginning, and then you go into, I would say, looking at February. February is typically a time where it's really good. You have a good time. They're in school. They're kind of in that moment. You have it's a holiday with Valentine's Day. You got President's Day. You got different things happening. But what I've found to be really, really a great thing in February, and kind of getting in that season with Valentine's, is talking about relationships, talking about the importance of boundaries in dating, and talking about even family relationships, family dynamics. Looking at February is a time of really focusing on relationships. And if you're looking at evangelism in that, you can say as a theme, we're looking at evangelism when it comes to relationships, and you may be able to talk about something, even pertaining missionary dating, and saying, is this the best way to go about it? Is there another way to look at this? How can we focus and navigate our relationships with family in the home? And for those that don't have saved family, and how can you approach those things? And so really kind of looking at that from the idea of relationships. In March you can be, again, kind of creative in those times. You've got a kind of a month to really, again, kind of build on this traction that you've been having, really focus in on some things. I found it to really be beneficial sometimes to really focus on some character studies in the Bible. It's getting more and more apparent that even in Phoenix alone, kind of the area, we're now the 9th worst Bible-minded city in the nation. And it's crazy to think that we're such biblically illiterate as a culture. Some of these students that we may be familiar with these stories, and may just jump to and assume, saying, hey, Paul is this dude, wrote over half the New Testament, and you may be referring to these things. I don't know how you would navigate that when you're talking with a student who has no context. And most of your students, that if you're reaching unchurched students who weren't brought up in it, they're not going to know these stories. They're not going to know some of the Old Testament stories of Jonah and Noah and Moses and Joshua. They're not going to know some of these stories as you kind of enter in. So you're going to have to lay some context and some groundwork. But I think the cool thing about that is to look at some character studies or some ideas of raising faith, some stories that would build their faith, and talking about the importance of faith, and not just looking at the reality and asking them to neglect it, but looking at the reality in the face and saying, you know what, my God is bigger than this, and I know if God could save me, I know if God could do this for me, then I know He could do it for my friends. I know He could do it for those around me. If God could do it for these characters, these heroes of the faith, look at Hebrews 11, and a great kind of just a marker kind of to look at all these stories of just individuals who didn't get to see the reward, but who lived by faith, who had a life that was actually very relevant to the students' lives, and helping to make that relevant in their lives, and helping to realize that these stories they're important to look at, but they're not just some Old Testament thing, some New Testament thing that's just stuff that we go back to and look at these ancient writings, but they're relevant, they're active, they're living in our lives today. So getting and not being ashamed of God's word, but going into it. April may be a time where you're looking at, this is kind of your last full month of school for some. Some have school all the way through May, but you're kind of looking at April as kind of something to continue to build off of, maybe talking about on their campus and making every moment count. Maybe they're transitioning from 8th grade and going into high school, or maybe they're transitioning from high school into college, and really focusing on kind of those critical moments and those times, those things that maybe those stumbling blocks that really get to them. And so you're maybe talking a little bit more about some cultural things and how that relates to their daily lives. And so we're going to be providing more resources regarding those things, some things that would address cultural issues, sexuality, prejudice with racism, and things that are going to be affecting their lives today. And so I'm looking at even some of the things that these students are addressing when it comes to drug abuse, and the conversation that they're having in school, and the things that they're having in the home, and so getting really on their level, and really trying to really till that soil and say, hey, let's look at how the gospel sheds light on this situation, how good news can come out of a bad situation. And so looking into May, going into summer, really focusing again on maybe some of the importance of those relationships, those intentionality behind choosing your friends, and making the most of your summertime. Maybe you're prepping for youth camp and you're promoting things strong, and you're looking at things. So there's kind of those peak season, those times where, man, you can really motivate them based on that momentum. Going through the summer, I know there's sometimes where there's that thought of maybe summer kind of dies down, and you have to kind of pay attention to your church culture as a whole. And let me kind of back up just a second, because I want to make a mention on this. This is something that's really important, is to make sure as a church as a whole. I know a lot of times youth ministry can kind of get focused and kind of start running, and you may be able to do things a lot quicker and move quicker than you would as a whole church as a whole. Or maybe you have a little bit more freedom to kind of talk about some specific topics, or kind of go on specific things, and maybe really make sure to go on a journey with people. But as a church as a whole, you want to really pay attention to where your senior pastor is going. And I should have said that maybe from the top in the beginning, because I don't want to minimize the importance of this. The importance of you guys as youth leaders. You are under shepherds. You're not the chief shepherd. Jesus is the chief shepherd. You have shepherds that are over you as your lead pastors, as your executive staff. Maybe you get the privilege of serving on your lead team and having those conversations when it comes to sermon planning. Many of our youth pastors do not have the privilege of being able to speak into that, and that's okay. But you want to be able to know where they're going. You want to know where your lead pastor is going for that year, and maybe just to say, if you don't know where your lead pastor is going for the year, and maybe it just seems like, hey, every month there's kind of a different direction that we're going, and so we kind of have to navigate those things. And I just believe that at any moment God's going to bless, again, your intentionality, kind of going behind saying a calendar year, this is where we're going, but kind of backing up enough to say, I believe that no matter what, we prepare, and maybe we planned a whole month on faith and really building apologetics and talking about how they can defend their faith on their campus, and we really plan that going into August, and we're excited about that. But our lead pastor kind of changed the direction. We're going to go a little bit different route. I want to say, as a youth pastor, I know that may be frustrating at times when you feel like you've got everything kind of planned towards this. But let me tell you that God's not gonna allow that to be in vain at all. Every bit of preparation that you had going into that, I just believe God's gonna honor you. God's going to be able to redeem that and use that for benefit. You may be able to pocket that and save that for something later. You may be able to provide that resource for a youth pastor friend in another area. You may be able to help others in just your preparation. You're not going to go wrong. Where you're going to be wrong is where you find yourself in a position where you're unprepared, you're underprepared, and you're saying we're going into this, and but my pastor's asked us to go this direction, and I have nothing to really go on. And it's great to be caught in those moments to say, you know what, I'm caught prepared. I'm caught ready to go. In season, out of season. You look at Scripture and you say, you know what, there's enough in here that, of course, I could kind of wing it and kind of go and just take a passage and just kind of run with it and just ask that God would bless it somehow. But I just believe that your preparation as a whole, God's going to bless that as his hand rests on it, as he just goes before you, speaks through you, and encourages you. I just believe that God's going to minister to you personally first, and then it's gonna pour out as the overflow of God's doing in your heart as a minister. God's going to be able to just bring revelation to these students. And so a lot of the things that will come into this, you're going to talk about these topics. You're going to talk about some of these things that you just want to hit as a calendar year going into maybe the fall. You're looking at specific things. Maybe you're going through a missions drive, maybe focusing on world missions, maybe focusing on the true religion. When you look at James and you see, man, the importance of taking care of the widows and the orphans, and say, man, never neglect the poor. Even as Peter, James, and John, they blessed Paul in his ministry to the Gentiles, and they said, you know what, the only advice we have to give you is remember the poor. And so it's this encouragement to even look at every situation you do and say, you know what, I'm not going to miss my heart for all students. It's the idea behind I want to develop a few, disciple a few, but I want to reach all. And I want to instill in my students, I want to instill in those who I'm leading, I want to instill in my leaders that are around me, that are volunteering their time. I want to invest in them, and the best way I can do that is to be as prepared as I can, to be able to take them on a journey, and by the end of this year to say, God, as a goal, bottom line, I want people to be closer to you because of our investment, because of our love for you, God. And I just believe God's going to bless that as you step out in faith as a youth pastor, as a youth minister. I know you've got a ton of things to be planning, but I just believe if you create space 4 times out of a year to say, you know what, we're going to look at it as a whole as a year, and then we're going to plan the details coming up. It's kind of like when you have something on your radar and you know it's coming up, you start to see those things a little bit more frequently. If you're in the market to shop for a car, all of a sudden you just start seeing cars all around, and you start noticing things and picking up a little bit more on it. Same as with a sermon. Hey, I'm going to be talking on a message out of John chapter 1, and I'm going to I know it's coming up in a month here, and that's kind of where we're going for. I know where I'm going leading up to that, but in John chapter 1, in the beginning, is the Word, and so I know that kind of the direction where we're going with that. I know the focus of it, and maybe God just gives you an illustration. Maybe part of your story, out of the margin you create in your life, God just starts to reveal things to you about what He would have you speak on those specific ones. And so in those moments, you already have the calendar out. You just make notes of those as they come, and really it just helps you plan and again kind of look at that 30,000-foot view as a whole and say where we're going as a year in a youth ministry. And I want to make sure as a youth pastor, as a leader for these students and these other leaders, that we're as prepared as possible. We're receiving a direct revelation from God, and we're able to brand it and package it in a way that's appealing to these students, but it's not missing the good news. And the bottom line is we want these students to know Jesus. We want them to know the hope of the world is found in Jesus. And so I just believe as a youth pastor, when you focus yourself, you're intentional with these things, you mark out and you carve out time like this, and you get the right people around at the table with you, I just believe you're going to have fresh ideas that come. God's going to bless this as a ministry, and I just believe God will help you bless others. And so as you package these things and you see these sermons you've developed and these themes you've developed, you maybe develop those and to see that out of the context than even our own youth pastors here in Arizona. So that's our hope, and our aim is to help you prepare, help you be as effective as possible in your sermon planning and your theme development. And we just pray that God would continue to bless you as you go before it.